Central de este congreso, que va a estar a cargo de Rahel Jaeggi, con el título El punto de vista de la emancipación. Pero I'm going to switch to English very fast because we want to understand each other now. So I have the honor to present tonight Rahel Jaeggi. She's professor of practical philosophy at the University Humboldt, Berlin. And she's also director of the Center of Humanities and Social Change at the same university. As you may know, Rahel Jaeggi, she's one of the leading figures of the fourth generation of the Frankfurt School. I would say like the post-Honetian generation. Her most influential books, in my opinion, are Alienation and Frienddom, her PhD thesis published in 2005, which she wrote under the supervision of Axel Honneth. And the second one is Critique of Life Forms, Kritik von Lebensformen, her habilitation thesis published in 2013, also supervised by Honneth, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay. So, and she just told me she finished her last, not last, but new book, Progress and Regression, Fortschritt und Regression, which will be published soon. So I don't want to talk too much, we are already late and you all want to hear Rahel. So having said that, I just want to give the floor to Rahel. The title of her presentation is The Standpoint of Emancipation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me here. As I said yesterday, it's an immense honor and pleasure, and I think we have already learned a lot. And it has been tremendously inspiring to be here. We have to solve the language problem at some point. So I'm very sorry that I don't speak Spanish, and I have my way to deal with it now is to have a PowerPoint presentation accompanying my lecture, so that at least the structure and parts of it will be you can read on the PowerPoint presentation. I'm not that great with PowerPoint, so don't expect fancy little pictures, moving stuff, diagrams and so on. It's just like the basic structure of what I'm talking about. So yeah, we are celebrating critical theory, the Frankfurt School, and again I was really surprised. I knew about Felix Weil and his Argentinian roots, but the fact that that somehow critical theory has does have these connections and has been not only inspired but made possible in terms of resources through this Argentinian heritage. That's really something that is a nice List der Vernunft. Nice way in which through all these like North and South and colonial, post-colonial situations, things like that happen and cut through. So I'm talking about the standpoint of emancipation, and I hope with the concept of emancipation to get at something that is a very important concept within critical theory, always has been. The idea to then confront it in the end with contemporary standpoint theories is something that, because we were just talking about fourth generation of critical theory, so one of the let's say side projects I'm working on is a history of critical theory that exactly does not buy into this generational stuff, because I think generation is always complicated. It creates family twists, it creates kind of being envious about one's siblings, or then also the whole story about who counts in, who doesn't count, who is left out, and so on. So the idea is to go along the systematical issues that, and I think one can identify some of them through the history of critical theory. So my idea would rather be to not only to conceive of critical theory as a Diskussionszusammenhang, people who are connected and are interested in developing a critical theory of society. This is how Albrecht Wellmer, who has been cited already today, puts it. And also Albrecht Wellmer was not only against the generation thing, but also against even the idea that it is a school. He always said, it's not a school, it doesn't have a headmaster and so on. So, yeah, to talk about emancipation, but then also, at least at the end, to try to confront it with contemporary movements who are doing critical, I mean, not only critical practice, but also critical theory in the plural sense, not in the critical, in the Frankfurt School sense, is part of what I'm trying to do here. So let's start with emancipation and the questions that I'm going to ask. So this is, yes. In his programmatic essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, Horkheimer understands critical theory as the intellectual side of the historical process of proletarian emancipation, and an element in action leading to new social forms. This does not only imply a certain understanding of theory as an actively intervening instance in the social process, rather Horkheimer openly admits that critical theory does not remain neutral towards the conflicting social forces, but sides with the antagonistic positions and cultural ideals present in society. Critical theory, as Horkheimer emphasizes in Avenue Formulations, is associated with a specific interest, the interest in social emancipation. It is thus partisan, it takes sides. None of the claims involved is trivial. At least three questions evolve. First, what is emancipation in the sense of critical theory? Secondly, related to this, why does emancipation as a practical process need an intellectual and theoretical side at all? So what is the role of knowledge? What is the role of theory in the process of emancipation? I mean, it is not at all clear that in order to do social critique you need a theory, and then it's also not so clear what kind of theory you need. And I would say that in the case of critical theory, the stakes are very high. The kind of theory that is needed is different from just some empirical findings that would let you know about the state of affairs in the world. It is philosophy actually that plays the important role here. And it is also part of critical theory's claim that through analyzing social processes and social crises, critical theory gets at like criteria from which to criticize, and also develops the kind of potential that should be able to overcome the situation that is criticized. So there's a lot at stake here. So finally, what does it mean for critical theory to take sides or to take a partisan position, while at the same time, as I would claim, aiming at universality? As we will see, all these questions are interrelated, which is always a good bet. Because critical theory has a specific and comprehensive idea of emancipation, it concerns action as well as knowledge. And because it is oriented towards emancipation in this sense, partisanship is a kind of anticipated partisanship, which in turn leads to a very specific understanding of the relationship between theory and practice. In what follows, I will accordingly first develop a comprehensive understanding of emancipation in critical theory, and I already warn you, this is going to be the largest part of this lecture. Secondly, define the connection between emancipation and knowledge as it appears in this context. Thirdly, examine the specific kind of partisanship that critical theory subscribes to. In order to do so, I will relate it to what in contemporary discussions of so-called standpoint theories is referred to as the epistemic privilege of those on the margins of society. So first part, a comprehensive understanding of emancipation. My thesis is that it is one of the specific characteristics of critical theory is its comprehensive and broad understanding of emancipation. That is a somehow positive concept of emancipation, even if it is gained through a negative or negativist perspective. This understanding has emerged from the historical processes of emancipation, a process of enrichment or accumulation that critical theory reflects, and in which it has simultaneously acted as a catalyst. The history of emancipations and the sometimes failed attempts at emancipation is thus sedimented in the concept of emancipation itself. So what then is emancipation, and what is emancipation within critical theory? I would like to begin with an attempt at a definition. Emancipation is the departure from a dissolution of relations of oppression and domination, of heteronomy and domination broadly understood. It is a process aimed at achieving self-determination in the broadest sense, at transforming social forms of life and the worldviews and self-relations that go with them. Emancipation therefore wants to bring about a qualitative change in the way humans live. Clearly, the linchpin here is how to understand the evolution of domination and heteronomy in its broadest sense, and how this is related to the qualitative change in how we live. This is what I want to point out in this first part of my paper. Now, my understanding of emancipation is not a timeless one. Not only the protagonists of emancipation, but also the content and the concept of emancipation have changed significantly over the course of history and through the experiences of various emancipatory movements. From the emancipation of the enslaved to the emancipation of women, from the civil rights movement in the US to Black Lives Matter and Me Too, from the emancipation of the bourgeoisie from the aristocracy to the emancipation of the working class and the edicts of Jewish emancipation. The conditions from which one emancipates oneself are diverse, as are the groups emancipating. But moreover, the process of emancipation and the understanding of what it entails have taken very different forms in the history of emancipation and emancipatory movements. Those changes don't come from nowhere. They reflect the problems that emancipatory movements confront as they arise from the conflict-ridden dynamics of the social world. And if things go well, they reflect a learning process, an experiential process, in which those understandings become at the same time more adequate and more effective. The history of enrichment. The history of emancipation and of the concept of emancipation can thus be described as a history of enrichment or accumulation, which does not mean that it is a linear process without backlashes. A comparison of our current understanding of emancipation with its origins is instructive here. In its Roman origin, the word emancipation meant release from guardianship. The son was emancipated, released, freed from paternal guardianship, and the slave from the master's ownership, who had been ritually taken into possession through the formal act of the emancipium, in which the future possessor lays their hands on the person to be possessed. So it was actually the symbolic gesture of laying hands on the future possession. So in which the future possessor lays their hands on the person to be possessed in the presence of witnesses. This one who had been taken into possession was now to be emancipated, released from the hand, or rather released into independence by that very hand. Thus, the process of emancipation, the process of emancipation in this original sense is first and foremost a legal one. It is secondly a unique event. And thirdly, it is asymmetrical. One is passively emancipated by another one who has the power to do so. As the German historian Reinhard Koselleck has shown, this concept has undergone an interesting transformation and enrichment in all three respects. First, emancipation is no longer seen as liberation from a narrowly defined legal relation, but now extends to the broader domain of general human relations and behavior. Second, emancipation no longer denotes a singular act, but becomes a potentially never-ending process. And third, emancipation is no longer regarded as something asymmetrically granted, but rather fought for and carried out by the very subjects of emancipation themselves. In a process of emancipation, as one can say following Jürgen Habermas, there are only participants, instead of an active and a passive sum. Emancipation is thus the self-activating liberation from conditions of dependence and heteronomy and it aims at more than just the absence of domination. Now, the last two moments of enrichment, symmetry, or of this accumulation process that I'm trying to lay out. So the last two moments, the symmetry and the never-ending nature of the process of emancipation, are relatively uncontroversial today. They are not trivial, far from it. But today, they are not very much disputed. Everyone knows that one must emancipate oneself. From the Combahi River Collective to the German band Tonsteine Scherben with the song Wir müssen uns selbst befreien. We have to emancipate ourselves, with the emphasis on it's we who have to do it. And barely anyone thinks of emancipation as a singular act anymore. The successive expansion of the scope of emancipation, though beyond the shedding of an external rule, is repeatedly contested. Let's go back and take a closer look then. Marx had already, in his controversial work on the Jewish question, called for human emancipation as a return to the human world and human economic relations, as opposed to the mere political and formal legal emancipation, in this case of the Jews, and understood this as the transformation of what he calls the abstract citizen into an individual human being that has become a species being in his everyday life, in his particular work, and in his particular situation. However, it would still be an all too narrow concept of emancipation, as one of the intellectual icons of the 68ers, of the 68 movements, Adorno's student Hans-Jürgen Krahe formulated it, if one understood human emancipation as aiming only at a change in the ownership of the material means of production, or at a fairer distribution of economic and social resources. So in this way, pointing out to the material preconditions for emancipation. Emancipation, as Krahe prepares the next step in the expansion of the concept, is not primarily a change in the ownership structure of society, but a change in the social relations or the social intercourse. He calls it Verkehrsformen of society. It is therefore about big political and economical issues, but also about the inconspicuous little everyday practices and the power relations that have penetrated even the smallest pores of social relations and the subjectivities shaped by them. In short, emancipation aims at the emancipation of entire forms of life. Thus, emancipation extends beyond the originally narrow focus on political and legal relations, not only to economic relations, but also to gender relations and intergenerational relations. They affect educational practices, our bodies, sexuality, work, and leisure. They affect socially shaped modes of perception and experience, and the relationship to nature. Following this insight, emancipatory movements address the political dimension of everyday practices and work to change everyday life. Obviously, the configuration and the constellation of 1968, the student movements, the international student movement, was the ignition for the practical implementation of this comprehensively enriched concept of emancipation. The creation of anti-authoritarian and self-organized childcare, the experimentation with new forms of relationships and cooperation, and a deconventionalization of behavior that extended even to dress codes, but also the new sensibility, simultaneously diagnosed and propagated by Herbert Marcuse, are examples of such changes. The phase of an emancipatory politics of forms of life, as my colleague Daniel Lloyd calls it, is beginning. Critical theory has made a decisive contribution to this. Marcuse thus describes the motive for emancipation as a yearning, I quote, a yearning for a more beautiful, freer way of life, and a complete revolution of the fragile forms of life of the conventional. Horkheimer, less prone to kitsch, talks about humanity finally being in control and rationally shaping one's own form of life. Such a critique of forms of life is also the quintessence of Adorno's Minima Moralia, which established in a sometimes dizzying way connections between the micro-practices of society and the structural conditions that encompass them. And And Horkheimer notes, the objects we perceive in our surrounding cities, villages, fields and woods bear the mark of having been worked on by man. It is not only in clothing and appearance, in outward form and emotional make-up that men are the product of history. Even the way they see and hear is inseparable from the social life process as it has evolved over the millennia. We can see that emancipation in this sense, or in the sense of critical theory, then would include the revision or the critical evaluation of all these influences. Our self-relations, our social relations, and our relations with nature, indeed, a qualitative change in the way humans live. Now it is important to see that from the perspective of a critical theory, this is not the icing on the cake that otherwise consists of the hard stuff of economical or political facts. To bring about change in those areas is rather seen as a precondition for even being able to address those questions in a radical way. And those areas, those micro-practices of society, and once again it is Adorno who does it in a most persuasive way, to spell out how in those little practices the whole of society is somehow reflected. So it's once again Adorno who in his typical manner of methodological acceleration concludes from the way people cultivate their front yards to fascist exclusion, and from the harshness we display toward things to brutality against people. Today this politics of form of life is in some ways more covert, and the issues concerned are ripped apart again. The merely cultural, some people say, from the social and so on, which is not the least of the problems, I would say, in the current situation. On the one hand, we are experiencing a radical transformation of ways of life at all levels, intentional as well as unintentional, emancipatory as well as non-emancipatory, progressive as well as regressive. The world is changing with or without us, and not always to our liking. On the other hand, the struggle over ways of life or forms of life seems to be taken up in part by the authoritarian right, with its equally aggressive and hopeless adherence to naturalized gender concepts and traditional family forms, while those who effectively question them often hide behind fundamentally liberal formulas of diversity and pluralism, combined with the negative and once again narrow understanding of emancipation as not being dominated. So I don't want to rehash old and fruitless debates here, but from my perspective, this is an unhelpful alliance between liberalism and post-structuralism that leads us away from the task of a critical theory, criticizing forms of life and addressing what is at stake here. We can now understand what is at stake in my earlier definition when I defined emancipation as the departure from and dissolution of relations of oppression and domination, of heteronomy and domination, broadly understood, as a process aimed at achieving self-determination in the broadest sense, and a transformation that brings about a qualitative change in the way humans live. This is exactly not the negative or thin idea of emancipation that those evoke who want to restrict critical theory and emancipation to the often, maybe all too often cited position of Foucault, we don't want to be dominated thusly, or we don't want to be dominated that much. Instead, it is the critique of a substantive form of life, a form of life as such, not just in its unjust or undesirable effects, with its ethical commitments, worldviews, relations to self and to the world. It is nevertheless not a substantial critique. So it's a critique of a substantial form of life, and according to this substance and everything that it inherits, but at the same time it's not substantial in the way that it would take its clue from some substantial idea of the good life. Rather, as we will see, it takes its clue from the negative. Which leads us to the problems of emancipation. Is the next. So clearly, critical theory has run into difficulties with its broad concept of emancipation. It has been accused of paternalism, perfectionism, an untimely concept of subjectivity and the like. The question now is how an enriched version of emancipation, which is no longer a unilateral, asymmetrical act, can be possible at all. The difficulty can be made clear by contrasting it with the original and narrowly defined emancipation. As long as emancipation is unilateral and asymmetrical, as long as one party has freedom and control over the other, the dominated, which it then grants to them, things seem to be easy. Authorship, rights, implications of legal capacity, and the right to self-determination only change hands, so to speak. They are transferred from the master to the dependent subordinate, who through this very act becomes a dependent. But how can someone self-emancipate? How can we emancipate ourselves unless we are already emancipated? Who educates the educators, as Marx asked? And in this case, who emancipates the emancipator? So my solution to this problem is some version of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. Does this mean that the problem of emancipation, I mean the problem of who emancipates the emancipator, does it mean that the problem of emancipation becomes apparatic? I would say not quite. The proclaimed processual nature of emancipation itself offers a first answer to my question. Those who are to be emancipated emancipate themselves in the very process of emancipation. So this is what I mean by pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. How does this help? Emancipation, conceived of as an emancipatory process, is neither a leap between two dichotomous states, unfree and free, nor is the potential for emancipation either there or not there. Processes of emancipation are processes in which the formless, so to say, takes shape as it expresses and articulates itself. As the indefinite, the formally indefinite is defined. Seen in this way, processes of emancipation are processes of articulation, the way Charles Taylor understands them with reference to Herder. In a process, or in processes of emancipation, we then actually manage to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, if you will. Someone in an emancipation process, therefore, does not need to know what the goal of emancipation, the future society will or should look like, and use this as like the external point from which to put himself out. He or she also does not yet need to be emancipated, because this is a question of the very simultaneously continuous and discontinuous process of working oneself out of a crisis-prone dynamic and a distorted mode of living. A process of emancipation in the mode of determined negation, as the Hegelian would say. What we can do, as again Krag, who is an almost forgotten member of the Frankfurt School, I would say, as again Krag puts it, is to start imminently from those distorted, repressed forms of interaction that bourgeois society has developed. We negate them, that is, in political struggle. Only then do we fulfill the promises of emancipation or realize the potential for emancipation. So the idea is here the process, the political struggle, the process of articulation in which things come to the, get to be debated and fought upon, is the very process in which we emancipate ourselves. In this sense, emancipation is both a radical rupture and no rupture, discontinuity and continuity at the same time. And it does not therefore require a prior essence of the oppressed, as many critics of the idea of emancipation suggest. Emancipation describes a process in which what is to be constituted is constituted for the first time. If emancipation is established as such a process, then it is both the mode in which domination is overcome and the goal of this effort. This is also the deeper, non-trivial reason why those to be emancipated must actually emancipate themselves, and why this can't be done asymmetrically and from the outside. If this resolves the question of how emancipation processes are possible at all, then Krag's remark also provides a clue to the question of the normative foundation of the concept of emancipation. There is the Aristotelian solution, more or less explicitly invoked in many contemporary movements, and the appeal to needs. There are human rights as a way out. There is the liberalism of fear or liberalism of pain, that is the somatic solution, and there is a procedural liberalism, which explicitly excludes the appeal to the good and thus would narrow the concept of emancipation again. My claim now is that critical theory does not choose any of these solutions to the problem of emancipation, but has a different solution. This solution is, surprise, left Hegelian, and it starts from the conceptual claim that human beings are capable of self-determination and that they must or always do determine themselves, even if many obstacles stand in their way. It is a conceptual connection, a conceptual truth, so to say, that is referred to here. As Christian Schmidt puts it, according to the creed of this tradition, human beings make their own history and cannot do otherwise than to make their own history. This means that the forms of common life are not predetermined for them by transcendent power, be it God or nature, but result from the collective cooperation of human beings, which, however, does not always take place consciously. This insight into the autonomous character of human coexistence leads to an emphatic concept of history. History is not a mere sequence of events, but the shaping of social relations which is increasingly conscious. History is therefore, in the famous Hegelian phrase, progress in the consciousness of freedom. And maybe during the discussion we can also talk about the concept of progress evoked here, but this is not, at least for today, not my topic. Critical theory, however, reverses the science. It is interested in the irrational, in the irrational, in the unreason in history, while also looking for the harbinger of reason in it, in the obstacles of seeing oneself as the author of one's own social relations or even one's own life, a phenomenon commonly called alienation, and in the regressive moments of history. What reason is seems to emerge as a counter-image to these obstacles and results from a historical process of experience that overcomes these crisis-laden blockages. I have now spent a long time on the first question, what is emancipation in the sense of critical theory? Let me now move on to the other elements I mentioned earlier with reference to Hawking. This will be answered relatively quickly, so we are not going to be here until 12 o'clock, and on the basis of what has already been established. So, next one. Back then to question 2. If critical theory represents the theoretical side of the historical practical process of emancipation, why does emancipation need a theoretical side of theory at all? And what does this mean for emancipation on the one hand and theory on the other? My thesis is, with the expansion and enrichment of the concept of emancipation, the connection between knowledge and emancipation has become crucial. Critical theory contributes to this, and it understands this connection in a very specific sense. Emancipation in the sense of critical theory is both a practical and a theoretical problem. Knowledge decodes or deciphers the conditions that need to be overturned. Knowledge becomes practical itself. It is not merely information about what exists, but concerns the givenness of the given and the self-relations of subjects. The knowledge required here is less factual knowledge, it is reflexive knowledge. In this sense, self-knowledge and world knowledge are intertwined. And that is why theory becomes practice and why practice needs theory. But then it is a specific kind of knowledge and a specific kind of theory that is at play. This is to say, enlightenment, famously the courage to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another, and the human being's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Enlightenment alone, and enlightenment is of course, let's say, a neighboring concept of emancipation, but it's important to see how enlightenment and emancipation differ in this very important aspect of the second, the emancipation, having this practical, another kind of practical dimension. I mean, we could say that enlightenment in those famous words by Kant is what leads to emancipation. And the idea here is it is not, there is something to it, but it's not quite just enlightenment. So enlightenment alone is not enough for those striving for emancipation. Ignorance cannot be simply replaced by knowledge, dependency by independency. It's not just a matter of courage. Just as it is useless to tell someone suffering from a neurotic compulsion to wash their hands that there are no deadly germs on their hands, emancipation is more than just an unbiased education about facts that add to our knowledge of the world. Emancipation involves knowledge, but not in the simplistic sense of knowing what there is. Part of the self-reflective process that is part of emancipatory processes is the attempt to make that knowledge accessible by overcoming persistent barriers and blockages of experience. Thus, emancipation, both in the social structural sense and in the individual sense, is related to the critique of ideology, to the ideological obstacles that prevent us from having access to our own experiences, emotions, and to the concepts we need in order to be able to even articulate our wishes, desires, and needs. In summary, emancipation is a form of enlightenment that must become practical and bring about a real process of social transformation in order to be effective. Emancipation is a process of liberation, but it is not only liberation from something, it is also a truly practical and transformative process that produces new relations of self and world. Not only are we prevented from doing what we think is right by power relations and what Adorno calls the false arrangement of the world, but we are also prevented from knowing what should be done or what is in our interest. The false arrangement of the world affects not only our factual and material social institutions and our practical relationships, but also our modes of perception. The connection between the theoretical and the practical aspect of emancipation is therefore close. The accessibility of experiences, both individual and collective, directly affects the possibilities of action for individuals and groups. And these experiences are more than just knowledge. Consciousness raising was not without reason the buzzword of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, and the process at work here should not be reduced, of course, to mere cognition or to find out that others are experience the same kind of domination. The philosopher Miranda Fricke has provided a sophisticated conceptual apparatus for understanding this. It is a matter of eliminating what she calls hermeneutic lacunae, gaps in the commonly available vocabulary for describing oppressive relations. What a critical theory then has to add to this is a social theory that analyzes the structural side and the functional necessities of that which is not by coincidence a lacuna. The weakness then of Fricke's celebrated approach to social epistemology lies in the solution at its end, the somehow disappointing and unconvincing reference to virtues. Epistemic gaps in the description of experience are then only part of the problem. As can be deduced from the ideology-critical moment of critical theory, it is also appropriate to trace the functional structure and rationality of the ignorance and the inability to know in order to uncover and combat its roots. Back to compulsive hand-washing, it is not unless we understand the deeper rationality of this, on the first sight just irrational practice, that we have an entry point for eliminating the blockages of experience and get rid of the compulsion. So now type 3 and the next foil, partisanship. This now is where the question of partiality comes up and the similarity with as well as the difference from contemporary social epistemology and standpoint theory becomes evident. To return to the pragmatic statement quoted at the beginning and to the last of the questions posed at the beginning, in what sense is critical theory partisan and how does its partisanship differ from the partisanship we find in contemporary discussions? Partisanship here meaning the idea of an epistemic privilege actually of those groups. As Horkheimer openly acknowledged, critical theory does not remain neutral, and so it is necessarily partisan. It takes sides. But how can it be partisan and at the same time come up with claims to truth? Is emancipation then just the emancipation of this or that group? Unlikely so, if you have in mind Horkheimer's appeal to reason and the goal of achieving rational or reasonable control about our individual and social life. But let's step back, or rather take an informative detour here and approach this question by way of comparing it with contemporary standpoint theory. As a reminder, that is the next. No next one?
Huh?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So as a reminder, what are the claims of standpoint theories that at the same time seem to be very similar to what Horkheimer and critical theory would claim, but also different from it? First premise is our capacity for cognition depends on our objective material living conditions and thus on our political and social situatedness in the world. Second one, marginalized groups have different experiences than privileged groups and therefore also a different epistemic relation to the world. These differences then can be compared and evaluated. According to standpoint theories, and I mean I'm here just giving a very broad account of a discussion that of course is extensive and has so many different positions already and so many conflictual positions as well. So according to most standpoint theories, the marginalized standpoint provides not merely a different but also a better access to an insight into the actual nature of the social world, an epistemic privilege. And then the fourth point, to recognize this privilege and to reflect upon the situatedness is a precondition for emancipation and or for fighting against or undoing domination and marginalization. The similarities, I would say, how am I in terms of time? Okay. The similarities between critical theory and standpoint theory are obvious. Both start from the situatedness of knowledge, its perspectivity, its locality, and both attribute epistemic privilege to certain suppressed positions and groups. To be clear, this kinship primarily concerns those positions in the debate that do not understand epistemic privilege empirically, as an empirical fact, but see it as the result of a process, as an achievement, so to say. And this is, of course, important because if you have a look at the way that critical theory from the very beginning has started with the disappointment in the historical class that should have brought about the revolution, the proletariat. So this is why even in Horkheimer's, or already in Horkheimer's first programmatic essays, the idea that one should trust in the proletariat as an empirical group has always been rejected. I mean, to the contrary, you would always say to trust in them as an empirical group would not only make theory weaker, but also their very position. But that is something that already in Lukács, where critical theory takes its clues, the idea that class consciousness is not just something that a certain sociological group has, but something that has to be transformed into, from class consciousness, from the class in itself, to class. Okay, you know what I mean. So, this has been a huge, and it is interesting to see how in contemporary standpoint theory those discussions somehow come back. The question of is it an achievement, is it an empirical status, is it, the very weak positions here would only claim that it's a matter of representation, and then of course the stronger version would always hold that it is a matter of our practical relation to the world. Something that we actively do, that shapes our experiences, but this experiences at the same time somewhat has to be developed into something. More importantly, a question arises that has already been widely discussed between some standpoint theories and critical theory. Why does the social contextualization of knowledge even lead to an epistemic privilege? Why do the subaltern not only know differently, but also better? This is sometimes assumed rather than asserted, and there would be a need for discussion and clarification here, a discussion in which I think critical theory can be helpful helpful in order to clarify some of the issues here. And on the other hand, it could help critical theory to develop a position here that is somewhere in between the idea that, I mean, a strong version of why this is a privilege or why they know better, and a very weak one. Which brings me to the last point, which I will address as my final thesis. This is the last one? Yeah. No, this.
No.
Sorry, I told you I'm not good with PowerPoint. And if I'm then doing myself. Yeah, so there was one before that says, I mean, that's about how this works in Habermas. I'm going to skip it in Horkheimer. I'm going to skip over this, and then no, you can stay with this, and then I tell them the last one. So we'll mix it up. So critical theory, as understood by Horkheimer, is only apparently partisan, or partisan only for the time being. It anticipates a correct standpoint, the standpoint of the abolition of the previous order, from which the impression of partisanship will disappear. Horkheimer's idea of partisanship is thus fundamentally provisional. It aims at the abolition of all particularity and partisanship in the name of a comprehensive notion of justice, emancipation, freedom, and happiness. The model for this is clearly Marx's understanding that partisanship for the proletariat is partisanship for the class that ultimately overcomes class society in general. So also in Marx, if we siding with the proletariat not only doesn't mean siding with it as a sociological group, but also it means that in the end this particularity will overcome in terms of arriving at a universal standpoint. This is something that has been criticized heavily by actually someone who probably is well known here or well discussed here, Laclau and Chantanou, who then I mean, try to change our ideas of emancipation according to this idea that it is there is no such thing as the universal in the end and the abolishment of the conceptuality. But with that, all the problems associated with that framework, some of the problems that Laclau mentioned seem to reappear. And also the relation to contemporary standpoint theory then seems to be broken. So last word, last sentence, only one more minute. My claim here is that it is precisely this provisionality that is the point, if one does not understand it in a static sense, as a placeholder for the general, as if the general or universal already existed independently of the confrontations to be undergone, but as emerging from the social positions and struggles that should be understood as struggles for the universal or general. What tentatively emerges here is what I would like to call, in line with my friend James Ingram, a bottom-up universalism. This means critical theory does not replace particularity with a preset universal standpoint, a view from nowhere, as a process of emancipation and as the art of establishing connections. It works itself through those particularities by way of an open-ended process of experience. It is this process that we might want to refer to with a term that is crucial to critical theory, reason. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rahel, for your talk. We have some time for questions. I will open the floor for questions, but I would like to ask you, is it okay if I collect questions and then you answer?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I mean, we only have 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, well,
That's good.
maybe I did it before. So, I start with Santiago.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Rahel, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you so much, Rahel, for this wonderful presentation and sharing this work with us. So my question should be the following. It seems in a point obvious that from Horkheimer to CONICET through Habermas, what seems to be at stake in the critical theory tradition is the relationship between emancipatory interest and critical knowledge. Particularly in the young Habermas and Honneth, this relationship is tackled with a sort of pathology talk. This talk has been criticized by Nancy Fraser in your conversation with her, more recently by Amy Allen, who, taking a Kleinian psychoanalytic standpoint, has questioned this talk. She says that the cure is that there is no cure following Chagall and Miller. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about these recent criticisms? Do you have any particular take on this way of dealing with the relationship between knowledge and interest, which implies, we can say, a normalizing standpoint?
Okay, thank you. There's some more question. Sorry, there's some other question?
I have one.
Okay. So, the organizers. So sorry.
No, I wanted to ask you that because in one of the slides you talk about the question of efficacy of the critique and the relation with the subject. So I was thinking about how just Santiago talked about last book of Amy Allen's Critique on the Couch, and especially I wanted to ask you what reflection do you have about this new way of thinking, the relation between critique and society in terms of transference, and thinking about not in a rational way the question of efficacy, for example, like talking about how a person is wrong or is ideological, and how can critique can also construct new ways of relating with the subject of critique. And if you think that this way of thinking from psychoanalysis and this dimension of affective and transferential relation between critique and object, or actually another subject, is can be productive also for critical theory.
Resumido en castellano se puede...
Perdón. Mi pregunta era a propósito de la relación entre la crítica y el sujeto criticado, que muchas veces es el sujeto que se pretende interpelar. Entonces, en la presentación de ella hay una crítica de cierta tendencia racionalista en la tradición de la crítica de la ideología, precisamente por la falta de eficacia en la crítica, en el sentido que puede generar el efecto no deseado, que es no contribuir a la ilustración, sino por el contrario generar como nuevas formas reactivas de rechazo. Entonces hay unas nuevas lecturas desde el psicoanálisis de Amy Allen que apuestan a recuperar la idea de transferencia en el análisis, desde el psicoanálisis, para ver si puede reformular la relación entre crítica y subjetividad.
Gracias.
So maybe one question more. Yes, Facundo. Yeah. You can
Luego le traduzco el español. Thanks a lot for the presentation, very interesting. I wanted to ask about this like self-bootstrapping process, lifting oneself by the straps of the boots, and this idea of bottom-up universalism, where maybe the subalterns go from a particular standpoint to a universalist position, because that particular standpoint enables a better understanding of the social totality, and I think that's a very powerful idea. But I wanted to ask, what is the role of struggle and of social struggle of conflict in that context? Because often the political activities of the subaltern sectors are like processes of self-determination, but at the same time there's conflict and struggle, and how is that process of conflict can be rationally mediated? Quiero que traduzca brevemente. En este proceso de emancipación, en donde nos vamos constituyendo una universalidad a partir de un punto de vista particular, que como es un punto de vista marginado, subalterno, tiene una mejor visión de la totalidad o permite elaborar una mejor visión de la totalidad. La pregunta es, ¿cuál es el rol del conflicto o de la lucha? Porque en los movimientos sociales siempre aparece la conflictividad social y no solo la autodeterminación racional, y cómo está, qué rol juega la razón en esa conflictividad social.
So I think we have a question from Regina also. Sorry, but well, maybe you can stand up first. Yeah, because or because.
Now I didn't write it down. So it's thank you for this for confronting this problematic notion of privilege, of who knows better, and it's a feminist problem also, and people like Harding and a lot of Anderson have dealt with this. Who knows better? And why? And this notion you brought, that the bottom-up universality that Facundo emphasized, I think is very useful, and bottom-up and like a dialogue with provisional, very provisional agreements that are always revisables, revisable. Thank you for bringing this problem of privilege and.
¿Podés traducir? ¿Podés decirlo en castellano?
Sí, dije, perdón, que me pareció muy interesante y le agradecí que trajera este problema, que es un problema, es una cuestión feminista también, ¿no? Del problema de quién, en inglés es como muy, pero quién sabe mejor, ¿no? Como el privilegio del punto de vista. Hay muchos puntos de vista, bien, pero la idea de que hay un punto de vista que es privilegiado por ser subalterno es una idea que es a la vez atractiva, pero problemática, porque si antes había otro, o sea, es como dar vuelta, ¿no? Pero no como Marx a Hegel, sino poner patas arriba, y bueno, pero hay otro privilegio, y entonces eso me parece a mí, y eso no lo dije, que coarta el diálogo, y después no sé qué dije, algo como el diálogo, distintos puntos de vista, diálogos que siempre llegan que a lo más que pueden llegar es acuerdos provisorios, siempre revisables y muy frágiles. You said it all, also very thin. No, Regina, very thin eyes. We are.
So Regina wants to ask something, and
nobody else.
I don't know. I think we can end this round with your question, and maybe if there's some more questions, because other way it's a lot of questions. Can you come here or?
Oh, I think it's okay. Thank you so much. It was so inspiring. And I have just two little questions. First, one sentence. Can there be an emancipation from democratic life form? From democratic life forms? So in the sense of right-wing and anti-democratic. And second is the question, which I completely agree with, emancipation is linked to partisanship, then emancipation always goes along with oppression. So it's always both. It's this dialectics in emancipation itself. Because it's always also about exclusion of those who are not yet emancipated. Is that the case?
Thank you. So I think you can answer these questions, and then we see if there are more. That's okay.
Or whether we start drinking the wine.
Or both at the same time.
Yeah. I had this kind of dinner conversation with a lot of wine and this discussion. Okay, so I try to be brief, which usually is not easy for me. I think I can address the first and the second question together. Maybe so. The first part of it, the pathology talk and the danger of its being normalizing. I don't see it this way. I mean, I see that the pathology talk is makes some presuppositions sometimes that then in the next step have to be reflected upon, but it is, for me, the so-called pathology talk is part of the negativism of critical theory. To start with the pathologies of our social world is also a negativist approach, I think, and I think there are good ways to get around this normalizing, paternalizing aspect that might, that some people think is inevitably bound up with this. So I myself do not use the concept of social pathology. I'd rather go for crisis for a variety of reasons, but I would be ready to defend it on probably the same terms in which I would be ready to defend the idea of a crisis. I mean, crisis obviously has a different, I mean, they both point to some kind of dysfunctionality. The crisis, the idea of a crisis is a bit more on the, let's say, objective or dysfunctionality side than social pathology always is. So this is why we prefer it, but it's more connected to detecting like systematic or structural systemic issues. I mean, the questions about the use of psychoanalysis here and Amy's new approach here. I mean, first of all, when I evoke psychoanalysis here, it's not that I would be ready to fully engage with the different schools and claims at stake here. I am much more, I'm critical of Amy's book as well as I'm critical of her progress book, and I think it's along the same lines. It is because I think that she somehow gives up on things. For example, in social theory, the idea of development that one should defend on or should reconstruct in a way that is not imperialist, I would say, and should reconstruct in a way that is also not teleological in the bad sense. I mean, there are different ways to conceive of what a teleological process is, but in the bad sense of it's just an unfolding of what has already been there, and there are those stages, and if you don't fulfill them. So in terms of social theory, I would be, I'm confronting this by spelling it out as a problem-solving process of a certain kind, and I think this, so the idea is to hold on to those concepts in social theory that enable us to understand social change in a specific way, while not ending up with this imperialist development talk. And I think the same goes on. In some weird way, the same goes on with respect to psychoanalysis here. But here I can only give you, just a couple of hints. First, I don't agree with the Habermas critique here. I very much side with, in terms of what, I'm neither a psychoanalyst nor a specialist here, that I very much side with him on this topic in terms of, I think it is a question of rationality. The critique has already, forever, has been like, he has an overly rationalistic understanding of psychoanalysis. I don't think this is fair. I think it is a very deep insight into the preconditions for having a relation to self and to even make a certain kind of experiences. And I think it's not cognitivist and rationalist in the sense that some people think. And going away from Habermas here, I think the idea of transference, of course, this is the most important thing, that you don't achieve the kind of insights that, and I would say it's not just about insights, of course, it is about a way to be able to deal with oneself, a way to have access to certain kinds of experiences, a way to not live with something like no-go areas in your own, with respect to yourself. And this, of course, is more than a cognitive process. And I would say it is a wide and again broad, rich concept of rationality that is at stake here. When, I mean, taking into account the vulnerability of experience and the, I mean, how many preconditions there are, and how many blockages there can be to a certain relation here. So I would say, and transference is something that, I mean, that is the very process in which, and this is what, I mean, that is like the starting point here, that it is not just by telling someone what's wrong with them. This is also where I would always say, where I use psychoanalysis as a methodological clue to how one could conceive of critique, social critique, in a non-asymmetrical way. Again, some people think that psychoanalysis is so asymmetrical, like it pathologizes the patient, it has this, and there's one who has all the knowledge, who brings in the diagnosis, the concept, and so on, and then there's the patient. It is like the master model of an asymmetrical relationship. I would say this is misunderstanding. It is exactly a model for how, I mean, a way even to explain how critique can work, because if those diagnoses, the concept, the thing that are, in the first moment imposed by psychoanalysts, if they are not productive, if nothing happens within this relation, the very relation, then it is a question of the right match here, and this is something that I think is very interesting, even for social critique. So you cannot, or for a crisis critique, there is no such thing as a crisis if no one experiences it as a crisis. Still, crises have this kind of, it makes sense to speak of latent crises and to say, okay, so you might not, in some way, this crisis might not have been turned into a conflict yet, might not be experienced as such, that again, in the long run. So I think it's the same kind of, there has to be mentioned. I think psychoanalysis here is as a model for interaction here. It has a lot to say about it. And again, I think it's a broader and richer concept of rationality. But of course, it is the idea of autonomy that is inherent here. And I'm a bit critical about Melanie Klein and about the use that a lot of people actually make of her. I would say there is a problem with the theory as such, but not something that we could deepen here. So the self-strapping process and the bottom-up universalism. What is the role of conflict and struggle? I would say conflict and struggle are important here, because it is through this, at least where I take it from, this idea of a bottom-up universalism, it is through conflicts and struggle, mostly, that those processes of universalization even come about. So it is part of the process, and an important one. Let me see. Yeah, and then once again to epistemic privilege and who knows better. And since you quoted Nancy Hartzog, I've put this picture as well. What I find interesting in the encounter between standpoint theory and something that resembles standpoint theory and critical theory, but in the end doesn't, is actually that it lets us see. Nancy Hartzog is a special case because she is a feminist Marxist, and her idea of how this, how the epistemic privilege comes about, is very close to, in this case, Horkheimer's or also Marx, because it's about our practical relation to the world in terms of our working relations. And she then expands, of course, what the realm of work here. She expands it to reproductive work, but it's still not just a position in terms of how I am discriminated, for example, which very often is the case too. I mean, sometimes it just has this negative, or some people just refer to the negative fact of being discriminated here, and Hartzog, as the critical theory tradition, refers to practical experiences and the way that the world looks different once you look at it through the perspective of care, for example. So this makes it very close to, brings it very close to critical theory, whereas other ones are much farther away. And I think in order to answer, not only in order to figure out what kind of an achievement it is and why it is an achievement. I mean, these are two related questions here. The first step is to spell out the achievement, or what kind of achievement it is that only leads to the epistemic privilege, and the next step then is the argument for why is this better. And what I suggested here, and I mean, I've been very quick at the end in order not to talk for another hour. What I suggested here is that one should bring these two steps together. The answer to why is it better, if it is better, lies in the in this achievement process itself. And that might give us a clue to something that is very often, somehow assumed, not always made it explicit, and so on. Democratic life form. Can there be emancipation from a democratic life form? Yeah, this is of course a very timely question, since a lot of those movements, those authoritarian movements that we see, I mean, on the streets and everywhere, they have this liberating, I mean, they pretend to, they don't use the language of emancipation, but you can see it. I mean, they think that they are liberating themselves from, let's say, the bondages that a certain kind of liberal, woke, whatever kind of theory has laid upon them. So it is, for them, it is a moment of liberation, and you can even see it in the pictures. I mean, if you look at what's going on at the storm of the Capitol, I don't know. I mean, there are people who obviously have fun and have this kind of regaining control thing, the kind of, so now we can make things happen and so on. I mean, it's not so different from what left-wing movements experience and claim as, I mean, what is fun about political action. And I mean, Hannah Arendt always said acting is fun, and I worry when I see those pictures, when I see those people. I mean, I would want them to, even from the way they behave, I mean, to see them as, let's say, to see their authoritarianism in a certain restricted way of, let's say, utterly hierarchical, military organized, and so on. I think it's not so easy. I mean, that would be a very, very easy thing to say. Yeah, I mean, those movements are differ in kind from the really emancipatory ones, because they have this kind of, and they do not. I mean, they are authoritarian, but at the same time libertarian, as Oliver Nachtwey has it, authoritarian rebels. So there is this rebellious moment, and so you could see where this comes from. I mean, to ask whether even from a democratic life form or from liberal culture, one might want to be emancipated. I would say, of course, this is not possible. This is not emancipation. Some people would say this is trick, but I think one can. This is where the idea that one should diagnose those movements along the terms of progress or regression comes in. I would say that there is something, not just about the goals that they want to achieve, but also about the way they do it. It's not so simple as to say, you see, they have to, I mean, they are all structured in a different way, but in the end it is getting back to the idea of crisis and conflict. In the end, I would say it is a regressive way to address those crises who are in the background of this experience. So if they pretend to have to be emancipated from a democratic life form, this is in some way a self-misunderstanding. So no, in my terms, no emancipation from a democratic life form. And then going along with the partisanship, the second thought, yes, absolutely.
So, maybe if you want 2 questions more, if someone is willing to ask something, or do you want to end the...
I want to open the wine.
Okay.
And I want to get some food at some point.
Okay, great. So then, thanks a lot for coming to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and for a great talk. And we can drink some wine now. And yeah, get some food.